All right, so before I get into this video, I just want to give a bit of a trigger warning here, as I am going to be discussing the details of this extreme form of protest. I want to make it clear as well, this is not an endorsement. I do not support this form of protest. This is beyond anything I can ever imagine. But it's important to give the facts here. It's important, as I'm going to discuss, how the media in some cases misframed this, in other cases did a great job discussing what happened here, and give you the context that there's historical significance in an act like this. And this is not out of the blue. This has been done before, and again, been reported on properly in other situations. Yet in this situation, some appear to have a tougher time being honest about what this act actually was. Aaron Bushnell, an active duty member of the U.S. Air Force, went in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. on Sunday and committed the most extreme act of protest, setting himself on fire in front of the embassy. So I'm going to do my best here to describe both what happened with the help of a lot of reporting, as well as showcase to you the various ways the media took this story, including, by the way, a really great example from a major media outlet that really surprised me. So I'll get to that clip later on in this video. But first, a little more here in what happened. So Discourse blog, writing here, on Sunday, Aaron Bushnell, an active duty member of the U.S. Air Force, went in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. Quote, "I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I'm about to engage in an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal." Then set himself on fire and yelled, "Free Palestine." Bushnell has reportedly died from his injuries. He was 25. Now, I'm going to give you some more context here, because this is clearly a very extreme form of protest. You may or may not be familiar, but this is, I wouldn't say it's common, but there are examples, high profile examples of this happening, and they've all been treated typically the same way in terms of recognizing it as an extreme form of protest, as opposed to, say, mental illness, which some outlets, some reports are attempting to paint this as. But as the Washington Post writes here, self-immolations are rare, but a number are connected to anti-war protests, perhaps most famously that of a Buddhist monk who set himself on fire in Saigon during the Vietnam War. An American Quaker self-immolated in 1965 at the Pentagon. During the Iraq War, an anti-war protester self-immolated near the Kennedy Expressway in Chicago. In 2010, a street vendor self-immolated in Tunisia, an act of defiance that served as a spark for the Arab Spring, in which numerous heads of state were forced out in uprisings. In December, a woman self-immolated outside the Israeli consulate in Atlanta. She had a Palestinian flag with her, authorities said at the time. And I'm going to touch on this last one a bit more later on. But I also want to give you some backstory here. Washington Post. So to my surprise, this article here, I saw, online, people saw the headline here and thought that they were trying to smear him. If you go on to read the actual article, that's not my takeaway. They give backstory here to who Bushnell was and his convictions. So an example of that, as they write, Lupe Barboza, 32, said she met Bushnell in San Antonio in 2022 at an event for a socialist organization. She said they bonded over their politics and started working together to deliver clothing and food to people experiencing homelessness. Quote, "He was outraged, and he knew that no one who is in charge is listening to the protesters out there every week. He knows that he has privilege as a white man and a member of the military." Other friends from San Antonio said they had talked with Bushnell about the Palestinians and their shared distaste for the U.S. role in the Israel-Gaza war, but he had not expressed to them any indication of what would take place in Washington on Sunday. And he also apparently moved to Ohio earlier this year for a course for service members transitioning out of the military. He was apparently set to be out of the military by May, and he decided regardless that he was going to do this. Now, again, if you want further backstory, I mean, it discusses there's some religion in his past, or like a religious, almost like a cult-like group, it sounds like, in his past. I'm not sure how much that played into any of this. Like, again, these headlines this is going to be a theme here. Like this headline, you could take this as, hey, they're trying to smear this individual. You go on to read the piece, it isn't that way. But the framing is everything when it comes to news stories. Most people don't read the entire piece, so it really tells you the narratives that are trying to be pushed out there, as opposed to what the reality of the situation actually is. This is just an image, so of course I'm not going to show the video. Obviously, even if I wanted to, YouTube wouldn't let the video appear. But this image, and this part's blurred out, but the image here of this this cop pointing his gun at a man who is burning to death on the ground, as PJ Harvey or Benjamin Miller here writes, can't think of a more iconically American and situationally fitting for the protest image than a cop pointing his gun at a man burning to death. Now, his Facebook post, that I believe this was the link to the live stream, because he live streamed this to ensure that it would actually be out there. But this was his Facebook post. Many of us like to ask ourselves, what would I do if I was alive during slavery, or the Jim Crow South, or apartheid? What would I do if my country was committing genocide? The answer is you're doing it right now. Yet, this is how, as Asal Rod here documented, here's how a lot of the headlines initially came out. Now, I'm going to discuss some of the changes that were made. So the New York Times, their headline, a man set himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy in Washington, the police said. So no discussions of Gaza, of free Palestine. The New York Times, the subheading, I'm not sure if this was added later or not, but the subheading does mention that he said free Palestine. So I want to give that context. The Reuters headline here did not make any edits. There are no changes here at all, but they do have a new article that gives more details. But a similar headline, U.S. airman sets himself on fire outside Israeli embassy. No mention of Gaza or Palestine. CNN Politics here, they include details in the article, but again, the headline, the way it's framed here, almost the exact same title. Airman sets himself on fire outside Israeli. It may be the exact same title. So they're kind of just parroting what others are writing here. And the Washington Post, same thing. No mention of Gaza. No mention of what the protest was for. It does include details in the article, but again, and you may think this is no problem. Whatever. The headlines say what they say. The details are in the article. Except this is not typically how other stories like this are covered. So Ryan Ruby here tweeted this out. The claim that U.S. media would have covered a self-immolation differently if it had been undertaken in protest of one of the country's adversaries is not hypothetical. So this article is up. I can show you right here. Russian journalist sets herself on fire and dies, blaming government. It's very clear what this is about. You read through the article. It discusses a history of oppression of journalists in Russia. So it gives, sort of the backstory to why this journalist felt the way she did. And again, giving rise to the details of what the protest was for, which is kind of the point of a protest this extreme, is to understand why a person would get to that level to want to do something like that. And it doesn't hide any of those details. It goes right into it in the headline, in the article. It's very clear. It doesn't discuss mental illness or blaming it on that. It's very clear what it's about. Yet when it comes to these headlines, they are a little more vague and don't give any of the real details till you start reading the piece. And in some cases, the piece is completely, what's it called? Blocked in terms of you need to be a subscriber to Reuters, for example. You can't read the piece unless you're paying them. So oftentimes the headline is all some people are going to get. Now, NPR. So some of the details, this is absurd. This is from NPR's article. As of Monday morning, NPR was not able to independently verify the man's motives. In the video that he shared, again, this video is accessible, widely available. NPR could have seen the video, even if you didn't want to see the part where he, committed the act. The part beforehand where he is calmly discussing, he's in his right mind. He's calmly discussing his motives and his feelings about Gaza, and it's not. There was no, nothing is hidden in terms of why he did this. Yet NPR appears to not know at all. It's weird to even write the piece if you're not willing to even watch the beginning of the video. Time here, this is an interesting one, wants you to know that Aaron Bushnell's self-immolation was against the rules. So they write how the Defense Department states that service members on active duty should not engage in partisan political activity. You could argue maybe this context matters and they're not trying to, I don't know, obfuscate or whatever other motive they may have here. But it's just I find it to be a bizarre piece of information to include in the piece. Then again, the larger piece, I'm sure, adds more details, but still a weird fact there. This is where we get to just this doesn't give enough information. It also, watch how this clip from MSNBC ends.
We have an update now on a truly tragic incident in Washington, D.C. Yesterday, 25-year-old Aaron Bushnell of San Antonio, Texas, the active duty airman in the U.S. Air Force who set himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy in an apparent protest against the Israel-Hamas war, has died. That identification made by Metropolitan Police here. Bushnell filmed his own self-immolation on his cell phone, yelling, "Free Palestine," before collapsing to the ground outside the embassy. He was rushed to the hospital for treatment, but later succumbed to his injuries. And if you or someone you know is in crisis, call or text 988 to reach the Suicide Aid and Crisis Lifeline. You can also call 1-800.
All right, so a few things worth noting here. And as Joshua Hill points out, I mean, these are the issues with this. So it's only a 45-second piece. Again, maybe they did more. I have not seen other reports. This is what I've seen. But in this report, they first describe it as the Israel-Hamas war. And it's worth noting, the Washington Post earlier, when I was reading that other quote, they also said this. I don't have to please describe all this again. This is not a war. This is a genocide. One side has killed 30,000 people, civilians. The other side, when this series of fighting began on October 7th, they killed 1,200. No civilians should have been killed or captured, but understand the situation of the occupation, the ongoing blockade, the decades of bombardment from the Israeli government, backed by the world superpowers against Gaza, and even the separation of rights, whether it's in the West Bank, whether it's in Israel proper. It's knowing the context. You cannot, in good faith, call this a war. So that in itself is an issue. But then going on to, for some reason, I can't say this is intentional. Maybe it is. But to have only the Israeli flag in the back is a little bizarre while delivering this report about a protest that was about the bombardment of Gaza. And then to end on the suicide hotline, which, in any other situation, I have no issue with. But without context here, this gives off the impression that this was an issue, a mental issue that Aaron Bushnell was going through, as opposed to this being an extreme form of protest that we have seen many examples of. So it doesn't properly contextualize what happened here, or what the protest was really even for. And then this is, again, showing you the differences here. Jeet here tweeted this out. Weird how this moment didn't provoke a discourse about self-care, mental health, and the contagion effect. Here's Hillary Clinton. This is 2016, holding a picture of a 16-year-old Tibetan boy who set himself on fire in India. So here, they're recognizing this form of extreme protest. And again, I showed you another example earlier. Recognize that form of extreme protest, but when it comes to one recognizing a genocide, apparently it's mental health as opposed to the actual protest and what it's for. Now, this is a great tweet as well. If you die in uniform while killing brown people, you are made into a hero. If you die in uniform protesting the killing of brown people, you are made to be mentally ill. Are these the esteemed values of Western civilization? Abby Martin here, writing, Aaron Bushnell is the second person to self-emulate over the Gaza genocide. The first was a woman whose name we did not know because her story was buried. This is what I brought up earlier. So I was reading off the various examples. I think it was in this piece. Various examples of similar forms of protest. We never found out who this person is. So this is the one report I could really find. There may be some others, but in terms of extra details, there are no more details. Her name isn't even here. This wasn't filmed. Bushnell very likely was aware of this and was aware of how uncovered this was and wanted to ensure that his protest would be covered and it'd be clear what it was about, which is why I imagine he live streamed it. But she goes on to say here, our monstrous rulers are forcing people to engage in the most extreme, desperate act of political protest just to be heard. Couple last things here. This is the CNN report. This is the one that surprised me the most. This is fantastic. Check this out.
We're learning new details today about a deadly protest outside the Israeli embassy in Washington. Authorities identified Aaron Bushnell as the person who, on Sunday, set himself on fire. The 25-year-old was an active duty member of the U.S. Air Force. CNN's Gabe Cohen joins us now with the details. And Gabe, this is something that he did in protest.
Yeah, that's correct. And we're learning much more about this 25-year-old active duty airman, Aaron Bushnell, as you mentioned. He's from San Antonio, Texas, and he live streamed his actions on Sunday in broad daylight on the streets of D.C. outside the Israeli embassy. We are not going to show that video. It is extremely graphic and disturbing. I have watched the video. I can tell you at the beginning, at the start of it, you can see Bushnell walking up to the embassy on the street in his military fatigues. He's speaking calmly to the camera. I want to read a portion of what he says. He said, quote, "I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I am about to engage in an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it is not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal." He then goes on to pour some sort of accelerant, it looks like, on his head out of a water bottle he was carrying. And then he lights himself on fire, Boris. And as the flames engulf him, you can hear him yelling, free Palestine," again and again, until finally he collapses. And that is when officers, you can see them race in, one of them with a fire extinguisher in their hands, trying to put out the flames. But it takes time. And as we have learned, Bushnell died in the hospital at some point later on. And look, it really speaks to the tensions that are continuing to escalate around the war in Gaza, not just across the world, but here in the United States. We saw a similar incident in December when someone self-immolated, lit themselves on fire outside of the Israeli consulate in Atlanta. But this feels different. This is an active duty member of the military burning himself to death on the streets of the nation's capital.
Gabe Cohen, thanks so much for the details. Appreciate it.
Look at the difference there. Gives full context, explains what they saw in the video, describes that this is not uncommon in the sense that this has happened before, doesn't try and put it aside as mental illness or, it's very clear about who, about what Aaron Bushnell was doing and why he was doing it. So, look, I criticize media I criticize CNN quite often. No criticism there. That was just a great piece. Now, I'm going to end on this. This is just, I don't know. I wasn't sure if I was going to fit this in or put this anywhere, but this is Joe Biden responding to a question about a ceasefire while eating an ice cream cone. Just kind of bizarre optics here.
Can you give us a sense of when you think that ceasefire will start, sir?
Well, I hope by the beginning of the weekend. The end of the weekend. At least my national security advisor tells me that we're close. We're close. It's not done yet. And my hope is by next Monday we'll have a ceasefire.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so some bizarre optics there, eating an ice cream cone while discussing Gaza and Israel. I'm not sure I would have... Why are you eating ice cream again? Just stop at the ice cream. It's enough. That said, people online were going after him over this. I think this is more of Seth Meyers' fault for bringing him out for ice cream again. Please stop doing this. But potentially some positive news coming down with a potential ceasefire. Again, I'm not going to jump to any conclusions here because we all know what we've been seeing, and it's hard to imagine any sort of end to any of it. But even at this point, a ceasefire after you have destroyed at least half of Gaza while killing 30,000 civilians, it's hard to really celebrate a ceasefire when you know the U.S. is going to continue supporting Israel. Like that doesn't appear to be coming to an end. So we're going to have to, wait on that ceasefire. But it's important to, again, recognize Aaron Bushnell, what his protest was for, recognize it as an extreme form of protest, not something I would ever encourage anybody do, obviously, but recognize it for what it was and in the context of other similar examples of that sort of protest. He was out there fighting for what he believed in, and I think it's important for people to remember that.